Did you all get it?
I got it.
All right. Thank you for joining us at our November board meeting. I am Leah Cruzy, board chair. Joining me tonight are my fellow board members and colleagues, Vice Chair Jim Sandman, Secretary Shakura Adamafanian, Treasurer Chantel Wright, and Nick Rodriguez. At present, there are 2 vacancies on the DC PCSB board. Thank you for joining us at our November board meeting. I am Leah Cruzy, board chair. Joining me tonight are my fellow board members and colleagues, Vice Chair Jim Sandman, Secretary Shakura Adamafanian, Treasurer Chantel Wright, and Nick Rodriguez. At present, there are 2 vacancies on the DC PCSB board. Mayor Bowser has nominated Carissa Stanley Beatty to fill one of those seats, which is before the City Council for approval. Ms. Stanley Beatty is a native Washingtonian and is no stranger to the challenges our students faced. I testified before the council on her nomination, speaking to her long-standing knowledge about the district, its families, and their needs. She has seen the evolution of education in the city and understands the need for high-quality choice options among students and families. In addition, as a mother of a DC public charter school student and Ward 5 parent leader of PAVE DC, she has direct experience navigating our education landscape. I urge the council to quickly confirm her so we can get her sworn in and to join this board. On another topic, as part of our strategic roadmap and in service to the students of the District of Columbia, the DC PCSB has been considering adjustments to our accountability system. As part of that process, we have engaged with the public, school leaders, and data and educational experts over the past 3 years. Recently, through this, I had the opportunity to participate in a learning session that Dr. Walker-Davis and her staff held with school leaders. I look forward to hearing from Dr. Walker-Davis and Melody Sampson, Chief School Performance Officer, tonight as they present what they heard, what they learned, and what they shared with school leaders. And Kirsten James, Director of Data and Accountability, will also join us for the discussion. This is part of our authorizing responsibility to monitor and evaluate public charter schools, and is in clear alignment with our mission that every DC student receives a quality education that makes them feel valued and prepares them for lifelong learning, a fulfilling career, and economic security. The work of this agency in pursuit of that mission takes many forms, including the actions this board votes on most months, including reviewing and renewing school charters, authorizing new schools, expanding campuses, school accountability, school goals, and more. Thus, while tonight's board meeting is important, I do want to note that there will be no votes on public charter school matters, and we received only 1 public comment registration requesting to testify at tonight's meeting. As a reminder, all written public comment is available to the public on our website. If you didn't sign up by sending your name to the public comment mailbox before this meeting, please do so by submitting your comments to public.comment@dcpcsb.org or call our public comment line to leave a voicemail testimony at 202-328-2660 and select option 2. In a moment, we will hear from Carla Grinnell, who signed up to testify this evening, and we invite Ms. Grinnell to join us and keep their comments to 2 minutes.
I'm promoting Ms. Grinnell right now.
Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Carla Grinnell, and I'm a 3rd grade special education teacher at Friendship Public Charter School at Woodridge. And I've been teaching in Title I public charter schools in the district for the last 13 years. With no breaks in my service. And I'm here this evening to speak about the agreed upon public charter school compensation for the 2022-23 school year, and how the current guidelines negatively impact myself and potentially hundreds more public charter school teachers in terms of the guidelines that OSSI has laid out, with that compensation of more than $73 million to public charter LEAs. The specific issue that I'm having with that guidance is the retroactive 7.6% increase for teachers from the 2022-23 school year base salary, and how the dates in that guideline excludes myself from receiving any retroactive pay, given that I've switched LEAs from last school year to this school year. So I was aware of the negotiations that were underway, and in late June that there was an agreement made, and I learned that from the media, but I was not informed by my former LEA. And given that I wasn't informed, I didn't feel like I was given all the information needed to decide whether or not I wanted to stay at that LEA to receive the retro payment that I'm entitled to. So I'm here tonight to propose to the DC Public Charter School Board an amendment to the guidance for the 23-24 repayment for teachers in my situation who have switched LEAs from last year to this year, who might be excluded given that the dates that are included in that kind of X us out. And thank you for your time and consideration.
Thank you, Ms. Grinnell, for all that you do. Our team has heard this and will follow up. This concludes the public hearing portion of our agenda. May I now have a motion to approve the agenda?
I move to approve the November 20th, 2023 board meeting agenda.
Again.
Second, thank you. Secretary Adam Afanian, would you be able to take a roll call, please?
Yes. Chairwoman Leah Cruzy,
Aye.
Board Member Chantel Wright,
Aye.
Vice Chairman Jim Sandman,
Aye.
Board Member Nick Rodriguez,
Aye.
and Shakura Adamafanian. I am an aye.
Thank you. Next on our agenda this evening is the election of board officers. Before we begin, I'd like to take a minute to remind everyone about how this process works. Every member of this board is appointed by the mayor and is approved by the DC City Council. We each serve a 4-year term and can then be reappointed for one additional 4-year term. Separate from that appointment process, the board usually votes to elect officers from among its members who will serve in that role for the following year. In September, we elected Shakura Adamafanian as secretary to fill the vacancy left by former member Ricarda Gandham. We will be voting on the position of secretary again tonight to bring it in line with our annual officer election cycle. I will now open the floor for officer nominations for this year's board officers.
Thanks so much. I would like to nominate the following slate of officers: Leah Cruzy as chair, Jim Sandman as vice chair, Chantel Wright as treasurer, and Shakura Adamafanian as secretary.
Are there any other nominations for any officer position? Hearing none, we will now take a roll call vote. The nominations are Leah Cruzy as chair, Jim Sandman as vice chair, Chantel Wright as treasurer, and Shakura Adamafanian as secretary. Madam Secretary, would you take the roll call vote?
Yes. Chairwoman Leah Cruzy,
Aye.
Board Member Chantel Wright, Board Member Chantel Wright,
Aye.
Vice Chairman Jim Sandman,
Aye.
Board Member Nick Rodriguez,
Aye.
and I, Shakura Adamafanian, am an aye.
Thank you. Next on the agenda is our accountability discussion. Dr. Walker Davis will facilitate this. Dr. Walker Davis.
Thank you, Chair Cruzy. As you know, my Chief School Performance Officer, Melody Sampson, and I will be presenting on our revised accountability system. And as you mentioned at the top of the meeting, we will be joined by Kirsten James, who is our Director of Data and Accountability, if there are questions around our presentation. But before I begin, I would like to check in, as we normally do, And as you know, board, we have embarked on our racial equity journey as an agency, and we use the Courageous Conversation protocol to help us engage with honesty, vulnerability, and open-mindedness. And so I will get started with us using our compass, which is a personal navigation tool brought to us by the Courageous Conversation, and really helps an individual know where they are and how others are showing up in conversations. And we are also introduced by Courageous Conversation to the 4 agreements and 6 conditions. And these allow us to stay engaged in conversation, to speak our truth, to experience discomfort, and to expect and accept non-closure. These agreements are the foundation for the conversation, while the conditions help us to build on each other's perspectives and examine the points where race and other isms intersect. So I would like to begin by checking in first on our compass. Again, this is a good exercise to help center an individual and others as we engage in dialogue. And I will model first and, of course, invite each board member to check in on where they are. So as I often am, today I am showing up in believing when I think about the important work that we have ahead of us and what it means to ensure that every student has access and opportunity to reach their highest potential. I see the work that we collectively do here at DC PCSB as contributing to that goal. I'm also showing up in the acting quadrant on the compass because of my role today as a co-presenter with Ms. Sampson. And I wanted to share a little bit about the identities that I bring into this conversation as well, because I think it is important to note those because it informs how I lead and where some of the passion around this work comes from. So the identities that I'm bringing into this discussion is a Black woman of Caribbean descent. As a child of immigrants, I was a first-generation public education student. I am a first-generation college grad. I am a longtime educator who's worked in various sectors, be it the traditional district, charter, governmental, nonprofit, and public-private. But of course, the most important identity that I hold, particularly when it comes to education, is that I'm the parent of middle schoolers who are navigating 2 different schools in our charter space. And as I think about the agreement that I am going to invite others to observe today is the expecting and accepting non-closure. This is very challenging. As educators, we want to be able to solve all of the problems that are before us, but this is work that has taken considerable amount of time. It is work that involves a number of stakeholders, and we are constantly going to be in the pursuit of improving what we provide to our students and families to ensure that every student in the District of Columbia receives the education that they deserve. And so I will invite Ms. Sampson to also introduce where she is on the compass, and then I will ask board members to do the same before proceeding in our presentation.
Thanks, Dr. Walker-Davis. Hi, everyone. My name is Melody Sampson, and I am DC PCSB's Chief School Performance Officer. Tonight, I'm showing up in the acting and believing quadrants, acting because of my role tonight, talking through the proposed revised accountability system. I'm also showing up in the believing quadrant because I believe that the system we're proposing will support you in making informed charter oversight decisions. I'm also in the believing quadrant because I believe that this system will support school leaders as they uncover programmatic strengths and opportunities for refinement or improvement. Like Dr. Walker-Davis, I encourage you to expect and accept non-closure. We are going to cover a lot tonight, and I imagine you'll probably walk away with lots of questions. That's okay. We've got plenty of time over the coming months to continue talking about this proposed system with you and school leaders.
Board members, would anyone like to share how they are showing up in this conversation before we get into our presentation?
I'll go. I'm showing up in the thinking portion, the quadrant of the compass. I think these are very hard and nuanced issues that require a lot of deep thinking. Like Michelle, I encourage everyone to expect and accept non-closure. We haven't made any decisions yet. Our work is still ongoing. I don't think we can expect, certainly not in this meeting, to come to any conclusions about anything. The perspective I bring to these discussions is informed by my awareness that my biggest break in life was something I had absolutely nothing to do with. It was the accident of my birth to my parents, Margaret Dugan and Ed Sandman, who came from very modest backgrounds. My father was raised by a single mother. His father died when he was 15 months old. But my parents were able to get, both of them, very good educations and to do well in life. And they were committed to ensuring that each of their 5 children had the same educational advantages that they did. No one's access to a good education should depend on the accident of their birth. I just got lucky. Access to a good education should not depend on luck. It's something that we have an obligation to provide to everyone.
Thank you, Vice Chair Sandman. Any other board member like to check in at this time?
I, like most of you, am also showing up in the thinking quadrant. I am impressed by the work that we've done to date around this accountability framework. I look forward to an update based off what has happened since our last roundtable. I am also in the believing quadrant, believing that this group of individuals has the best interest of children and families in the district, belief in our schools and our school leaders, and believing that the things that we're doing are in the best interest of those stakeholders. In terms of agreements, I want all of us to speak our truth. I want that to be something where people feel open and honest about how this is impacting them and their thoughts about the work moving forward. I am coming to this as a Black woman that lives east of the river, the communities that are hit hardest in our city by structural racism, poverty, you name it. And I'm also coming and showing up as a former school leader that understands the impact that the last time this organization rolled out accountability framework, what it did to both school leaders, schools, and our sectors for both the positive and the negative, and understanding how that changes or impacts how school leaders operate. And I hope that I can represent their voices as well as, and most importantly, the children and families that I've had the honor to serve as a school leader, specifically east of the river, and understanding who they are, what they need, and making sure that that's at the forefront.
Today, I am showing up in the believing and thinking spaces on the compass. I'm grateful to be here among my colleagues. Believing because I deeply believe the world urgently needs the innate talent and abilities and brilliance of the students of this city. A great education is critical to set students on a path to realizing their full potential and their fulfillment in life. I believe that DC charter schools can and do play a unique role in making that possible, and that our role as the authorizer is to ensure the enabling conditions are there for students to thrive in the schools that they and their families choose. Thinking, because of the privilege I have to sit in this role, including as chair of this body, and the commitment I have to the students of this city, I'm learning and I'm considering what we have heard from school communities, from experts, and from what this body has learned over the past several years and past iterations of accountability frameworks here and elsewhere. The identities I'm bringing to this discussion are: I am an Asian American woman of mixed race, a child of immigrant parent and public school teacher. I'm a person of privilege who is able to walk through life with much more choice than most. I'm also the parent of 2 elementary age and public school students. I'm a former educator who has worked in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors, always with a commitment to improving lives and improving communities. And with the agreements, I think, as others have said, I I commit to each of these agreements and invite others to observe, accepting and expecting non-closure. We have work before us yet.
Thanks to all my colleagues for their contributions. So I'm showing up in the acting quadrant today. I think because if I think about this framework, we've been thinking about it, working on it for a long time, and soon will come the moment when we start to put it into practice. And my hope, I think our hope, is that the framework, when it is at that state, will be something that really does drive action and reflection and improvement on the part of all of us, by the way, right? Like school leaders, every constituent of the system, us as a board, as we look at the kind of data and the ratings and other things that it produces, that it is a kind of place that will drive reflection and action for all of us. So I'm thinking ahead to kind of what that will look like and what it'll take for the framework to do that. The agreement that's, I think, on my mind most, like with many of my colleagues, is speaking your truth. I think there are on this board, let alone out there in the city, right? Like lots and lots of different perspectives on this framework, lots of interest to take into account. We need to hear and be aware of all of them. And we have to then make decisions that, won't be pleasing to everybody, but which will be important as far as getting us to a decision and getting us to be able to move forward. And so, but hearing people speak their truth is sort of just a necessary precursor to all of that. So something I'm going to try to encourage my colleagues to do as well. And then finally, the perspective I come in from today is that of a multiracial person and a parent in a multiracial family and a parent of 3 elementary school age children. Also a first-generation American, a child of immigrants, someone for whom, like with many immigrants, I was told growing up just how important education was, and got to see that lived out in terms of sort of where our family ended up versus where our parents ended up. And so that's my deeper why to be here. I think also as a multiracial person, I think there's a certain sense in which you don't ever see yourself as part of one particular community or one particular tribe exclusively. And my hope is that is part of what it means to bring together multiple truths, integrate them, synthesize them, find common ground. I'm hopeful that perspective will be helpful in this discussion.
I am showing up to this meeting in the thinking and believing quadrant. I truly believe that as a city, we have the talent and certainly the passion from the team here at the Charter Board, and as well as through our school leaders, and the commitment to really developing a framework that not only supports all of the work that is happening, but also pushes our city forward as we continue to develop strategies to support young people. I am showing up to this conversation as a Black woman who is a native Washingtonian with a unique perspective of really remembering the beginning of the establishment of the charter sector. And very much, even in my young age, remembering all of the promise that the sector was to bring to the city. I'm also showing up as a proud mother of a 4-year-old now, who is just starting her education journey, and all of the excitement and angst that a parent carries as their child walks through the education system. I bring all that lens to this conversation. I'm also coming to this conversation as a former school leader to young people east of the river, understanding how critical this framework will be to ensuring that schools understand exactly where they are and where they need to go in support of our young people. Lastly, I show up to this conversation as a nonprofit executive working on behalf of communities who need the most resources to truly choose the life that they want. And so I bring that passion to this space, and I am committing myself and invite my other board members to observe, listen for understanding, as we've done throughout this process, and Dr. Walker Davis and the team has done really and truly to set up a process that is sort of give and take and sharing and listening to develop what we have before us to continue to talk about. And then finally, speaking your truth and leveraging all the identities that you have and bringing that forward as we move forward with understanding where we are.
Thank you, board members. At this time, I want to invite Kirsten James to share where she is. Tonight, you will actually hear more from me and Melody than you typically do when we're talking about our accountability system. But rest assured, Kirsten is here to get into very detailed responses. But I did want to give her an opportunity to check in on where she is showing up to this conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Walker Davis. I am here just in case. I have prepped you guys. You are ready. You can do this. Thank you. Good evening, board members. My name is Kirsten James. I am DC PCSB's Director of Data and Accountability. I, like many of you, am showing up in the acting and believing quadrants of the compass. I'm in acting because tonight I am actively listening to your discussion. I'm in believing because I genuinely believe that the revised accountability system has all of the necessary components to be an effective tool for oversight and school improvement. The agreement I invite others to observe today is to speak your truth. Multiple perspectives is what continues to push the team to think more broadly about this work, and we really need folks to show up and speak their truth.
Wow, thank you all for checking in. You know, it is important that we continue to do this because it is powerful to hear the multiple perspectives that are on this screen right now. And this is a small sliver of what is represented in our agency. I heard a lot of believing in our check-in, and I hope that the public understands that this work comes from deep passion. Yes, this is a very intellectual work, and we're bringing all of our professional selves to this work, but we are informed by the beings that we are, and believing was very strong in all of the statements that I heard. I would say that if you're not already there, certainly throughout this presentation, I would encourage you to lean into the thinking quadrant as well. Naturally, as we're talking about technical information, it will certainly spark questions and a need for information, but we will have ample opportunity to navigate across the compass as we discussed today. So our objectives today are to learn, to ask, to consider, and reflect. You will hear, as Chair Cruzy mentioned at the top of the hour, much of the information that we shared with LEAs at the end of October. We will have an opportunity for you to ask clarifying questions about the technical design of the framework. We will invite you to consider the implications of the proposed accountability system on our students, our educators, and community. And as always, this is an opportunity to reflect on what additional information you need from us as we get prepared to bring the accountability system to you for a vote in the winter. So I want to first start by talking about our timeline. And as you see, we are now in November. And over this month and next month, we are preparing to give some additional data to our schools around how their school community would show up in the proposed framework. We are going to have tonight's discussion as well as our December board meeting specifically focused on accountability. I know I have opened almost every one of our meetings with an update on where we are in that process, but tonight's discussion is going to be a pretty thorough conversation as well as next month. And I do want to say that next month we will have the opportunity to be joined by Dr. Christina Grant, our state superintendent, and it will provide an opportunity for us to talk not just about our accountability system, but where there are similarities and differences to the state accountability system. In January, we are going to release a proposed technical guide as well as a pilot scores to our schools. And this is really to give them a sense of what the starting point would be for this new accountability system. And we will open our proposed technical guide for public comment during that January-February period. We are hoping to have at least one public hearing, possibly two public hearings in the March-April timeframe, on that technical guide. And just to remind everyone, the technical guide is actually the policy document that outlines the entire accountability system and all of the frameworks therein. And we are hoping that this body will be able to vote on our proposed technical guide no later than June, so that we're able to have schools start planning over the summer and throughout the next school year for implementation on the framework. And then starting in July of 2024, we are going to start a pretty extensive process in supporting schools in identifying school-specific measures and negotiating with our relative school communities around those measures to be included in our framework. Okay, so I want to, of course, ground us in our guiding principles. This is a slide that this board is quite familiar with by this point, and is a reflection of the process that staff and board engaged in almost 2 years ago now to set the context and foundation for how we look to revise our system. Our accountability framework analyzes school performance as part of our effort to make sure that every student gets an excellent education at each of the schools. And we strongly believe that this accountability system that we will be proposing does reflect our vision and mission. It is a tool that will allow us to reward high levels of growth for most of our students. It will provide a rigorous and attainable benchmark to measure school performance. And while it focuses primarily on outcomes, those are in both performance and school climate measures. I do want to say before going on to some of the specifics that we did use these guiding principles to inform our process throughout. But what you will see tonight also reflects the feedback that we heard directly from school leaders, the counsel that we received from individual board members, the expertise of data experts, both local and national. And we've made considerable changes to the system along the way so that we believe we've landed on a tool that really helps us shine a more accurate light on the bright spots and where we have more work to do to increase student outcomes. So I will walk through the proposed frameworks in the accountability system. You will understand the technical design of the system that we're proposing and what are the significant changes from our current performance management framework, or PMF. And you will be able to see that by the various grade configurations that we employ. So first, I want to start by saying that our revised accountability system includes 5 frameworks based on the students served. We have the pre-K only framework, as you see here, pre-K 8, high school, adult education, and alternative education. The pre-K 8 framework in particular is comprised of 5 sub-frameworks, which accommodate the various grade levels depending on the school's specific grade band configuration. I'll walk through the major differences between the PMF and those proposed frameworks by those grade bands. So for the pre-K only framework, you will see here that there are going to be, instead of the 3 tiers that we are familiar with under the performance management framework, there are going to be 5 levels in the new accountability system. And here, this is really for us to get a more granular look at the performance of our schools. We previously had all of our measures in the PMF done by the all student group, and we will be disaggregating our measures and calculating them by student groups for almost all of the measures in the framework. You'll also notice that in the PMF, we had our floors and targets set by sector performance, which means that they were based on the performance of charter schools. And in the new accountability framework, we will be having our floors and targets set by state performance where available. And that means that it will not only reflect the performance of charter schools, but all schools that are pre-K only for those specific grade levels. In terms of where what was called mission specific showed up in our framework, those were schools that did have specific measures unique to the programming of their school site. We did have an opportunity for that, even when we had the performance management framework, but that was on top of the measures that were included in the framework and negotiated separately from the PMF process. In the new accountability framework, we are going to have the school performance measures baked in, if you will, or included in the overall score of a school. I'm really excited about this aspect of our framework. We got a lot of feedback over the process about making sure that we had a mechanism to reflect the uniqueness of our schools, and we agreed that that was an important factor. We obviously were in the habit of doing mission-specific goals, but we thought it was so important that it should actually be baked into the overall score for a school. So you will see that in this and many of the other, in all of the frameworks coming forward. And in our, one last point I will make, Melody, in the pre-K only, OSCE requires an annual class observation. We have allowed for pre-K only schools to opt into a second class observation in our framework.
Dr. Walker Davis, before
Yes.
I just want to make sure I understand the protocol for tonight. Do you
Yes.
want us to hold all our questions until the end, or if we have clarifying questions on the slide, how do you want to handle that?
If you do have a burning clarifying question, I can take that. We've tried to break this up in chunks, so I wanted to be able to do all of the comparisons and then take a pause and ask a question. But if you do have a clarifying question about this, then please, I can take that now.
I think the only thing I'd want to clarify is, because I do think it's going to show up in all of the frameworks, when you talk about the floors and targets set by the sector versus set by the state, is that something you're going to talk about in more depth? Because I think it's important for the public to understand the difference.
Yes, Melody is going to actually walk through what all of this means in terms of calculations and measures. I will say at the top here that under our performance management framework, we compared our universe, if you will, was the performance of all charter schools. In the new framework, wherever there is a measure that can be calculated by the performance of all schools serving similar populations, we will use that, which means it will include floors and targets associated with students in both charter and DCPS. And our thought here is to, particularly because we are disaggregating this by student group, is to compare a particular student to performance of similar students across the state. But Ms. Sampson and certainly Ms. James will be able to answer any more technical questions around that later in our presentation.
Thank you.
Okay, the pre-K framework is probably the most comprehensive in terms of all of the moving pieces here, but I will do some top line messages here. First, I want to say that, again, similar, you will see this in all of our frameworks. We are going to be shifting from 3 tiers to 5 levels. We are going to have similar categories in the new accountability system as we did in the performance management framework. But what you will see here is that there is a shift from student progress and student achievement and school environment, student progress and student achievement to school progress and achievement. The emphasis here being on schools. We, as an authorizer, we measure school performance, not student performance. And we thought it would be important to make that distinction in this new framework. And again, I want to point out, we will be including the category of school-specific performance as a consistent measure across all of the frameworks. Similarly, we'll have most measures calculated by student group. Same for the floors and targets. Want to focus on our state assessment performance. I think you heard some feedback around our commitment to look at proficiency as defined as 4+ on our statewide assessment, currently PARC and in the future DC CAPE. We are committed to doing that, but what you will also see here is that we will have distinct floors and targets for both proficiency as well as growth for elementary as well as middle school. And again, we'll get into some of that specifics later in the presentation. Want to make a point that even though we are focused on 4+ proficiency, We have multiple measures of growth in this new accountability system, and this does reflect our value to award high levels of growth in schools and to really put a greater emphasis on growth, given where we know our sector and, quite frankly, state is right now regarding proficiency. So you will see a measure for growth that includes MGP, growth to proficiency, and the inclusion of growth on our access assessment. There is also the opportunity for schools to opt in to using school-selected nationally normed growth assessments for bonus points. And here, this can only help a school. It will not hurt a school if they choose not to opt in. You'll see in the pre-K-8 framework that we are shifting from in-seat attendance to chronic absenteeism. This is aligned with OSSE as well as the research around focusing on absenteeism. And again, school-specific measures are embedded in this framework. Next, I want to talk about high school. You will see many of the same elements in the pre-K-8 framework. I will not repeat those, but I do want to focus on here, what you will see is a shift from the college acceptance measures in our PMF to college and career acceptance. And this is an area where we want to be able to reflect the work that many of our schools are doing to get students career ready. And that will be reflected in opportunity to show progress here. We also are looking at SAT and ACT college ready, and looked at the multiple measures that were in this framework under the PMF and made some adjustments in that category. All of the other measures are similar to what you saw for pre-K-8. So in collaboration with our adult schools, we've made several updates to the framework to ensure that it accurately captures the tremendous effort that our adult schools invest in the everyday lives of the students that they support. So like the other frameworks, the adult schools will also have a score of 1 to 5 on the performance levels. You will see here that the categories within the adult framework will be renamed again from student to school achievement, and we have merged here the college and career readiness category with the school achievement category in the adult ed. We also revised our approach to setting targets, particularly the aspirational targets, and we're moving away from the previous practice of targeting 100% achievement to have targets that are more informed by state and national averages. And this shift really allows us to establish equitable but challenging targets that reflect the actual work and quality that's happening in our schools. Our commitment to showcasing the hard work of adult schools is also evident in the expansion of our earned high-level certification measure. We now consider a broader range of certifications, including mid-level and additional industry-level certifications in the proposed revisions. And this approach encourages diverse programming and presents kind of a more comprehensive picture of the adult schools' contributions to preparing students for their futures. And based on feedback from school leaders, we've consolidated multiple measures into one that's now known as the entered, retained employment or post-secondary enrollment rate. You'll see that comparison there. And then I would say probably one of the most significant changes to the adult framework is the removal of the in-seat attendance measure from the school environment category. So instead, we've shifted our focus to student persistence, recognizing that in-seat attendance didn't really capture the full scope of the unique and diverse programming that's happening at adult schools, but that persistence was a more accurate measure of the efforts that were happening there. And then consistent with our other frameworks, we've transformed the display-only mission-specific here, again, in the adult space to those baked-in school-specific performance measures. And that, again, like every other framework, that will be a factor in the overall scores that they have. I do want to make a point before turning it over to Melody to talk about the actual mechanics of these frameworks that we are not making changes to our alternative education framework at this time. We did some extensive work with our alt ed schools just a couple of years ago to land on the framework that we're using. We have been in discussions with those schools, however, with aligning the names of the categories and the other frameworks with the names of the categories in the alternate ed framework. So you may see that minor change coming when we bring that proposal before you, but no substantive changes to the measures and the way that those frameworks are developed. So with that, I will pause and see if there are any high-level questions here, recognizing that Melody will go into greater detail in the next few slides. Okay, turn it to you, Melody.
Thank you, Dr. Rucker-Davis. The proposed pre-K through 8 high school and adult education frameworks have 4 categories, which emphasize school performance, as Dr. Rucker-Davis shared. The proposed pre-K only framework, however, only has 3 categories, and you'll see those on the next slide. The alternative framework, as Dr. Rucker-Davis says, has category names that are slightly different, and they come from the 1920 PMF. We did discuss aligning those category names with the category names that we're proposing in the revised system, and school leaders had some mixed feedback for us about that transition. Ultimately, I think we'll tease out that conversation a little bit more before we make a final recommendation on whether we should actually align the category names in the alternative framework with the remaining frameworks. Regardless, while category names are the same or similar, it is important to know that the measures within the categories are different across frameworks. So let's take a look at the proposed categories for the pre-K only and pre-K through 8 frameworks. As you can see, we place a heavy emphasis on the school environment category in the pre-K only framework. And in the pre-K through 8 framework, we place most of the weight on school progress. In both of these frameworks, as well as the high school framework and the adult framework, we propose the same amount of weight on the school-specific performance category. That would be 10 points. So this slide gives us a look at the precise measures that we're proposing for the pre-K only framework. In the gray and white, you can see the current measures that are under the PMF. What we see here is that we are proposing a 36-point spread for the school achievement category. And this category measures our youngest learners' performance on age-appropriate growth and achievement assessments. We have a whole list of pre-approved early childhood assessments that we ask early childhood educators to choose from, and then those become the basis for these 3 measures in the school achievement category. Most of the weight, again, is on the school environment category, with the bulk of the performance falling on the class measures. The next slide shows us early childhood, which is a sub-framework of the pre-K through 8 framework. This measures performance among students who are in pre-K through kindergarten. You'll see some similarities in this proposed framework to the pre-K only framework, but I'll highlight the differences. We propose adding a school progress measure that captures growth on MAP among kindergartners. We'll also introduce a chronic absenteeism measure for upper level students, but we'll retain a pre-kindergarten in-seat attendance measure. This sub-framework also introduces a re-enrollment measure that's not really an appropriate measure for an early childhood pre-K program, but it is worthwhile once you introduce the kindergarten grade. This next slide shows the primary sub-framework, and it is for schools that serve students in pre-kindergarten 3 through 3rd grade. The main difference here is that we now have PARCC or DC CAPE measures to include in the sub-framework. Additionally, you'll see that we've added access growth to the school progress category, and this measures emerging multilingual learners' English language acquisition growth. The next two slides give us a view of the measures and weights for the elementary sub-framework. This first slide specifically shows you the proposed measures and weights for the pre-K through 5 sub-framework. Unlike the primary sub-framework, the elementary framework's growth measures are based on PARCC CAPE performance. Dr. Walker Davis already talked a bit about the growth to proficiency measures, but you'll see that this is the first instance of those measures in this framework. It's appropriate to do this measurement for the pre-K through 5 band because you need 2 years worth of data to actually do this analysis. So this is the first time at which we can incorporate these measures in a framework.
Melody, can you go back to that slide?
Sure.
So if class is, wait, this is not the slide.
Sorry. So this is the pre-K through 5.
Yeah, but if class is optional, how would that work with those scores?
Class isn't optional. So class is a requirement per OSSE. The optional component is that schools have the choice to do a second class observation in addition to the one that OSSE requires.
Got it. Okay.
If they opt in, then we average the outcomes across the mandated class observation and the opt-in class observation.
Okay.
All right, so this is also the elementary sub-framework, but this time we are looking at a school that is serving students between kindergarten and 5th grade. And in this case, you don't see any class scores because there aren't any pre-K classes to observe. All right, so this is the big whopper. This is our proposed elementary middle sub-framework that covers the full continuum grades pre-K through 8. As you can see, these measures in school achievement and almost all of the measures in school progress are broken down into specific grade bands. So we've got measures that cover grades 3 through 5 and 6 through 8. The only measure that we don't do a grade band is access growth, and this is because the N size is likely too small if we broke it down to grade band for some of our campuses. And so by keeping it at the school level, that allows us to continue reporting on performance. This slide shows us the elementary middle sub-framework that covers grades K through 8. And as you can see, this iteration of the sub-framework does not include any class measures. Next, we'll take a look at the middle school sub-framework, which covers grades 5 through 8 and 5 through 9. These measures are the same as the ones on the previous slide, but the difference here is that we don't have a need to zero in on a particular grade band because of the small, it's already at the grade band level. So next, let's take a look at the high school and adult ed frameworks. Our emphasis shifts here where we are putting most of the weight on the school achievement category. And in both instances, as I said before, school performance gets 10 points. So under the high school framework, you'll see that there are some commonalities to the pre-K through 8 framework. It's also pretty similar to the current high school framework under the PMF. The key differences, which Dr. Walker Davis spoke to, begins with the elimination of the SAT-ACT benchmark measure. We removed that measure because it is aligned with outdated UDC admission criteria. UDC no longer requires the SAT or ACT for admission. Dr. Walker Davis also previously noted that this this framework includes an expansion of the college acceptance measure by including acceptance into a career academy. And this is an acknowledgement that some students may choose to pursue other pathways after graduation. We are proposing some subtle shifts in the adult ed framework. For one, we are eliminating the college and career readiness category, but we are moving the data collected within that category to the school achievement category. As Dr. Rocker Davis said, we are collapsing these two measures, the entered employment / retained employment, into a single measure, and that creates a much larger school achievement category worth 50 points. Additionally, you'll see that there are some name changes between the student achievement measures in the PMF and the ones that we propose. We did this to sort of simplify the language and make it more accessible to lay people. Finally, as Dr. Rocker Davis said, we are eliminating the attendance measure. We found that it's not a strong fit for the adult ed sector, especially given that students in adult ed schools have a lot more flexibility to complete their studies relative to K through 12 students. So this slide gives us a look at how we propose setting floors and targets. Before I actually do a rundown of the proposed approaches, I'll just do sort of a memory recall on how we use floors and targets in the accountability system. The floor is the minimum measure rate for which any points are rewarded. So if a school performs below the floor, then they earn 0% of points possible. The target defines success on a measure. It's the maximum measure rate for which any points are rewarded. And performance at or above the target earns the school 100% of points. There are 4 floor and target setting approaches that we are proposing for the pre-K only, pre-K through 8, and high school frameworks. For most instances, we'll be using state performance data. And when state data aren't available, we propose using charter sector data. In other instances, it's appropriate for us to derive the floors and targets using publisher information. And finally, there are some instances in which we propose aspirational targets, and these are designed to sort of stretch a school and set a benchmark for excellence. The alternative education framework has a slightly different approach. We start with a mixture for floors using charter sector and national performance data. The aim here is to collect as much data in our sector and nationwide as possible, and then determine the lower data point and make that the floor. And then for targets, we are taking an approach of doing something that is more data informed, still using charter sector and national data, as well as state performance rates, and using that to inform what could still be called aspirational targets we still want to push our schools in this area. But in the current PMF, most of the targets for adult schools are set at 100, and we heard loud and clear from adult educators that they encourage us to set something that is more attainable. All right, so this is where things get a bit more technical. The most significant shift in the proposed accountability model is that we account for student group performance. This adds nuance to our evaluation system that doesn't currently exist in the PMF. As you know, we considered over 50 different student group calculation schemes, and we grappled with the most equitable way to capture student group performance. This was particularly challenging because there's lots of demographic variation across our portfolio of schools. We landed on an approach that upholds our guiding principles, is mathematically sound, and acknowledges stakeholder feedback. So I'll talk through this at a high level. It speaks to the calculation method that we hope to apply to the pre-K only, pre-K through 8, and high school frameworks. As you know, PCSB prioritizes outcomes for all students, but particularly those furthest from opportunity. Over half of DC public charter students are at risk, and so we propose placing 40% of the weight of outcomes among students who are identified as at-risk learners. On the other end, we've got a not at-risk group that gets a weight of 20%, and every student falls in one of these two student groups. From there, students can show up in all of the other student groups or none of the remaining student groups, depending on in size. The charter sector is just over 8% emerging multilingual learners, and we can expect that share of the population to grow. So we have put weight for EML students at 10%. And then the sector is made of 15% students with disabilities, and that is the weight that we have given them in this scheme. The at-risk, not at risk, students with disabilities and emerging multilingual learners student groups are static. The racial/ethnicity student group gets 15% of the weight, but it is a dynamic student group weight. And I will talk more about that on the next slide. So here we can see the racial/ethnic groups that we will account for in the proposed system. Black students, Latino students, white students, and other students. And the other category includes American Indians, Alaskan Natives, Asians, Native Hawaiians, other Pacific Islanders, and students who identify as two or more races. We've combined these racial and ethnic identities into a larger other group because they make up individually less than 3% of the charter sector. If we don't group them, then we might miss the opportunity to report on their performance in the system altogether. So what happens here is that of this 15%, it is divided proportionally based on the student population specific to the measure in question. And I will emphasize that that is specific to the measure and not to the school. So there are instances in which the denominator does not match, the denominator in a measure doesn't match the population at large. And so that just gives you an opportunity again to see how nuanced our framework is, where we are zeroed in on the precise makeup within a measure rather than the precise makeup across the school. I will stop there because we've got one last slide that covers performance levels, and I'm happy to answer questions, and also Kirsten can chime in if she wants to clarify or refine anything regarding the student group calculation approach.
Board members, you've heard a lot thus far. So any clarification, any questions here at this point before we talk about levels?
I proactively ask my questions.
Okay, Melody, continue.
All right. So this is a look at how we propose assigning scores and performance levels. We begin by calculating each school's score, and this is done by taking the total points earned over the possible points. This results in a percent of points earned, which maps to a performance level. A school that scores a school that scores at least 75% is deemed level 1, and we propose describing this as exemplary performance. A school that earns a score between 55% and 74.9% is level 2, and we propose deeming level 2 as strong performance. A level 3 school is described as satisfactory, and that is a school that scores between 54.9% and 35%. Level 4 schools are schools that we would describe as weak performers, and those are schools that score between 34.9 and 20%, and then any school that earns a 20% or lower is deemed unsatisfactory. As Dr. Walker Davis shared at the top of this segment, we see this approach as adding nuance to our framework. It is a much more granular look at school performance that enables you and school leaders to better differentiate performance. So I'd love to get some reactions to this proposed language. It's the first time you're seeing it. The last time we had a conversation about levels, I know that there was some mixed impressions across the board. Some folks who didn't want us to use language and others that encouraged it. So I'd love to hear your take on what you see tonight. And then I'd also like to get a feel for your reaction in particular to seeing a school that is level 2 or level 3. What does that mean to you?
I continue to like the idea of having language to describe what the meaning of the level number means. The one that I want to think more about is strong performance for level 2. And I say that because of the range reflected in those numbers. Describing 55% as strong concerns me. I think that might be an overstatement. I recognize that if that's going to be the range, 55% to 74.9, we need to have one term that both encompasses and is accurate for the 74.9% school and the 55% school. Strong might work for 74.9. I'm not sure it does it all for 55. I don't have a solution for you on the spot.
And if I can join Vice Chairman, I completely agree and have a similar reaction to level 3 being named satisfactory. Again, at the 54 to 35%. No, I cannot sit with that or accept that rather.
I know that this is an area where we have also been trying quite a bit to figure out what's right. How do we send the right message about our guiding principle of rigorous and attainable? How do we send the right message around our desire to see improvement? I do, and I know that this board knows this. I just want to make sure that I am making this clear to our viewing audience. I think whenever you hear percentages, obviously you think about 100 and you think about a normal sort of systems that we're used to seeing graded. I want to point out that this is 75% of all of the measures in the framework, which Melody just shared, which are now going to be for almost every one of the measures disaggregated by student group. And so I do want to make the point of saying that while we are used to some of these percentages on our performance management framework, we've designed a framework that is fundamentally different than that process. And so there are a lot of ways that a school can show progress on this that's not the same as under the performance management framework. So a 55, we may have collective memory of what that might have represented on the performance management framework, but it will not represent the same level of accomplishment or effort under our new system. But I too have struggled, and we've spent a lot of time internally with finding the right words to convey what we want. And I know we got some feedback from our guest in July around the utility of either of the number or the name approach.
This makes me think of systems of assessment in other parts of the world, like in England, where a 60% is a very, 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 very high score, and no one ever gets, greater than a 70 or something like that. That will require, I think, some messaging if we were to sort of do it that way. But I get what you're saying, right? If we really do believe in the data modeling, that getting over the bar of 75% is a really, really, really significant accomplishment, then it may be that everything else sort of keys off of that. But we should assure ourselves and convince ourselves of that it's that, and not the current way the data modeling just happens to place our schools who haven't yet had a chance to react to and try to improve on this framework, right? So that's just something I think we should think about. I will, just to say, I completely agree with and understand the tensions that have just been raised. I will add that I think that it's important that we have a level at which we say, I'm assuming we're implying here it's level 3 satisfactory. Above that, like we consider it various ranges of kind of, I don't know what word you want to use, acceptable performance. There won't be big interventions, but there is a path to grow on, which I think is good, right? When we think about like a level in this construction of things, a level 2 or 3 would mean you're performing solidly, but there is room for improvement, and the data and the nuance in the data should give you a signpost for what you should do about that, how you can get to more equity, greater overall achievement, greater progress, et cetera. I think that's, in my mind, what that would mean if we settle on the right answers to the questions my colleagues have just raised. I'll say one other thing. I also like, and I know not everyone's going to agree with this, but the fact that we do call out that below that level, we use a word like weak, which I know is a bit provocative. But that we're saying you're below a certain threshold. I think sometimes we use euphemisms at that state. We'll say something like developing, for example. And I think that that's probably a disservice to those who are kind of reading and trying to understand what the framework is saying. So anyway, those are my comments.
That both of those comments are helpful, and I think that I want to put on record that we will be sort of revisiting what we proposed once we actually see school year 22-23 data. So schools are validating school year 22-23 metrics with us right now. And then we'll be taking that data and applying it to the proposed model. And we might find new information that compels us to make some shifts, in which case we would make some adjustments before we ask you to open the technical guide for public comment. My hope is that all of the modeling that we've done to this point will be consistent even with the 22-23 data, but I just expect that we will have much more robust data in the coming month than we did based off of the 21-22 school year, which has been the bulk of our analysis.
So Melody, I actually would like for you to unpack that statement that you just made in terms of using 22-23 year data to revisit. I think it's important that we're very mindful of communication to public, particularly around something like this. What does it mean to say that after looking at the data, we could change if we believe that the framework that we have is strong, and we believe that it's the right measures, and we believe it's the right bar? How would 22, and I know you don't know because you haven't done the work, but how could it impact or change? Unpack that just a little, remembering who our audience is.
Sure.
For me, forget the audience, for me, unpack that.
Sure. So what we know about school year 21-22 is that that was a return to more typical data collection and validation, but it still wasn't quite at the level of data collection and validation that we were used to before the pandemic. And so just the quality of the data from that school year is not what we are accustomed to. Conversely, we expect the school year 22-23 data to be much more robust. Schools have returned to form, and so we just expect it to be a much more solid body of data. And it could reveal new information to us that we didn't have when we were modeling the framework using the 21-22 outcomes. That said, I do ultimately believe that what we put forward, thanks to Dr. Walker Davis, Kirsten, and her team, is a solid model. So I wouldn't expect there to be significant shifts between what we're presenting tonight and what we might bring forward in January. But you could see some slight adjustments. So for example, I could see a world in which we perhaps adjust the cut points, for example, depending on how schools perform using the simulated 22-23 data. It also will have an impact on floors and targets for the measures that use state and sector floors and targets. Those will be focused on performance in the 22-23 school year. And so right now our floors and targets are set using, I believe, 18-19 data. And so that will necessarily need to change once we've got a new set of data to incorporate, and could have implications on the model itself.
And
wait, just quickly as a follow-up, Leah. So I understand definitely where the floors and targets might change as a result of that. Can you just share a little bit more when you say looking at it, the cut points might actually change as a result of that?
Yep, that's a response to Board Member Rodriguez's comments. We right now,
Whether or not 75 was the, okay.
right.
And Board Member Wright, I would say that we probably would more likely look at levels 2 and 3, like if there are some shifts that might need to happen in that area. So I too, like Melody, am not expecting huge changes, but I do think would be irresponsible not to look at what that data suggests and see if there's any need to revisit.
Thank you.
Thank you for this. I want to build on this. My hope is that this is, forgive me, there's some vacuuming happening near me. My hope is this is a clarifying exercise for school communities and primarily for us. What we talked about when we started this journey a couple of years back was that we want a more complete picture of how schools we have authorized are serving students in alignment with mission and vision. No need to restate all of that now. With that in mind, with what kind of frequent, and of course this will be dynamic, right? So if this is a 3.0 accountability framework, because there have been 2 past versions of it, there will be a 3.1 and 3.2. We make revisions to the technical guide. Does that mean that we should expect to see these cut points change in a dynamic way year over year, while floors and targets will understandably change?
Not year over year. I think our instinct right now is to hold firm on these cut points for the next, probably, I will go ahead and say probably about 5 school years. We certainly want schools to get accustomed to something that is predictable. And if we make those adjustments year to year, it means that we are we're moving the target, and that wouldn't be fair to schools.
Right, so where I'm going with this is that the school's board holds the charter, and it's really important that the LEA board understand the expectations of how we're defining what excellence looks like. And if it is so dynamic, it seems like it would be hard for that board to be able to do its role in holding its executive director accountable and approving budget, all the role that they need to play.
And I co-sign what Chair Cruzy said. I think it's key, which I think brings me to my next question. I know that you've met with school leaders several times, and then most recently did a series of small group meetings with leaders based off of the grade bands, et cetera. How was the proposal received by school leaders, and what was their greatest concern? What kind of feedback did you receive from them about this proposal?
On the whole, we heard a lot of really good feedback from school leaders. Of course, they had technical questions. We did a whole activity modeling the student group calculation approach for the pre-K through high school leaders. And I think that really crystallized what we are hoping to do. Among high school leaders in particular, they had questions about our emphasis on the student achievement category, whereas in the pre-K through 8 framework, we are emphasizing progress. And so they've asked us to sort of think more about the weights in that framework. And we have committed to doing that. We haven't necessarily said that we are going to make any precise shifts at this moment, because it takes actually a lot of work to do those kind of adjustments and then model them. But it's something that we are open to shifting potentially before we ask the board to do a vote on the framework. Dr. Walker-Davis or Kirsten, were there other points?
And before you answer, Dr. Walker-Davis or Kirsten, so Melody, can you share why we are giving more weight at high school level to the achievement versus the, I'm going to mess the terms up, but can you talk about why we make this decision at high school as we're considering, particularly given the concerns raised?
Yeah, I'll tell you that the whole accountability systems in general are art and science. And so you have a really hard job of balancing priorities. And so at the high school level, we have the job of acknowledging the struggles that students and educators experience because of the pandemic and even before the pandemic, but then also needing to remember that high school is the terminal experience for most students in the public school system, and school high schools have a special job of needing to push students into college and career readiness. And so that requires an emphasis on achievement, and that just doesn't exist in the pre-K through 8 framework. So we, like I said, just have a hard job of trying to figure out the right balance between those two categories for high schools.
I would add that in addition to the feedback that we received about high schools in particular, and yes, lots of questions about exactly how the student group calculations would work, I didn't hear a lot of disagreement with including student groups. And again, we landed there from feedback that we had all the way at the beginning in the advisory groups and throughout the technical work group process. I was surprised that we didn't get a lot of feedback around the levels, but I will say, based on what Melody shared, that this will become more meaningful for schools once they're able to see their data reflected in the model, and particularly the most recent testing data. So, excuse me, I would expect that we would have more robust feedback once those calculators are in the hands of schools, and once they also are able to see their pilot scores around where they will land and the implications of that. And I do want to take this time to address a point that board member Rodriguez made about like what the work will be to shift the narrative around a 5-level system compared to a 3-tier system. And we communicated to our LEAs, and this was a question, board member Wright, that was asked. We asked LEAs, how would you communicate these changes to your board? And I think this is the one area that they are seeking support in, being able to say, if what we're proposing is that level 3 is satisfactory performance, if in our ecosystem, a tier 3 meant beginning conversations about revocation, then we need to contribute to a narrative that level 3 is satisfactory and very different than level 4 or level 5. So I would say that that is a takeaway for me. What can we do to help contribute to the narrative around this shift? And as you know, from our last board meeting, we had education board partners here talking about the work of engaging LEA boards, and we want to do more work like that in supporting LEAs, because we don't believe that the burden should only be on the LEA leader to explain what this accountability shift will mean.
Changing gears just a tad bit, I'm curious, how will this data be presented to schools and families? And are you presenting it as each framework as a whole or per subgroup?
So in the initial years, the data will be just between PCSB and school leaders. So let's see, school year 24-25 data will be the first official year under the framework, but that will be deliberative data that we release to schools in the fall of 25. School year 25-26 is the first year that we expect to make the data public, and I imagine that we will be creating an updated school quality report that gives you a view of each campus's performance under the revised accountability system. We haven't actually gotten to the point that we've started to talk about what that school quality report looks like, or even what an accompanying dashboard will look like. But because there's so much more information packed into this proposed model, we can expect to see some student group analysis that we weren't producing under the PMF.
Thank you.
I think this may be premature, but I want to follow up on Shakura's very important observation. I think we are going to need some communication help in dealing with the public. This is very complicated. And I think it's important that we be complete in what we present to people, but not overwhelm everyone with so much information and data that it's not usable to them. Doing both is hard. It requires real communication expertise. It's really important to do it in a way that people can make sense of the information we're giving them.
I think you can expect quite a bit of engagement as we start to socialize the model, and particularly when we get into the implementation phase and the public reporting phase. You might remember that PCSB created a parent handbook that was a distilled version of the school quality report, and we'll probably be doing something similar for this iteration of our accountability system.
I'd love to, we've talked about a couple different areas that are significantly different than the last version of the framework, and wanted to ask about the mission school-specific measures. Those sound potentially really innovative, and we have a wide variety of unique programmatic models, and this seems like potentially a great opportunity for some schools to showcase what they uniquely offer their students and be able to show how that's generating learning gains. So what kinds of measures, what kind of parameters are there? What kind of measures can schools choose when identifying those measures? And do they have to correspond to these categories of the framework?
So we would generally like the school-specific measures to correspond to the categories, but we are trying to be very open so that we can capture unique aspects of school programming. Some of this might be as simple as identifying, say, a school already has its own charter goals. It might be as simple as identifying the 2 goals from the charter agreement that they want to pull over and report on publicly as a part of their accountability system. It also could look like a school coming to us with currently being evaluated under the PMF and now needing to identify 2 new measures to report on. We've also talked about giving schools the opportunity to sort of duplicate efforts. So they could select 2 measures that are a part of the standard accountability system and make those their school-specific measures. And that might be appealing to a school that has a more traditional program that doesn't have any significant programmatic variation that we haven't already accounted for in the system. I don't want to say that the world is your oyster, because we do want these measures to be rigorous. But I think that we are open to doing some hard thinking with school leaders and figuring out the right fit for capturing sort of the essence of their model, but also having a meaningful measure that will be a good fit for the overall system.
If I may, I'd follow up with going in another direction. Often the adult schools kind of feel like they live in a different category, as they do. But can we spend a second on that? And I want to understand why that framework seems to be the only one that doesn't calculate measures by student groups. Can you clarify that for us?
Yeah, so I used to wear the adult ed hat at PCSB. They are a wonderful group of school leaders and schools and students, but the student group populations aren't a good fit for the adult ed model, primarily because the state does not acknowledge emerging multilingual students when they are adults, and same thing with special education status. That doesn't apply to an adult ed program. Additionally, the at-risk category doesn't apply to adult ed students. So that reduces us to using race and ethnicity as the sole student group that we could look at. We could consider that in future. You mentioned earlier like a 3.2 version of the accountability system, but we aren't there yet. And we might find that it's not worthwhile to go down that road, but ultimately, those 3 main student groups that you see in the pre-K through high school framework just aren't a good fit for adult ed because they don't actually receive funding for those student groups.
And I do know that you know this, Chair Cruzy and other board members. It is not that adult ed students don't experience some of the same factors that students in these groups do in our pre-K-12 experience. They just do not receive, as Melody said, dedicated funding, and nor do the adult schools get specific support for serving those populations. So to evaluate them against that would not be consistent with how they are funded to provide services.
That helps. Thank you.
On the subject of sort of the different education frameworks, is the alternative education framework, wanted to ask about that. Is it really a single framework, or is it multiple distinct frameworks? And can you say just a bit more about how alternative schools fit into the current and proposed system?
Right. So as Dr. Walker Davis shared, we did a pretty significant overhaul on the alternative accountability framework a few years ago. So that's why you don't have very much conversation about them in our revised work. I do consider it a framework within the greater system of accountability, and that's because it establishes criteria for evaluating alternative programs. So we've got a whole set of indicators that we use, and when schools demonstrate that they have a population that meets those criteria, then they're eligible for the alternative accountability framework. And from there, we go about setting school-specific measures or charter goals for those schools, and then that's what we report on when we produce public school quality reports.
That's great. Helpful to understand that. And then I have just one big picture zoom out question. You all alluded earlier to just the fact that, like, we're generally collaborating with our friends at OSSI. Dr. Grant, who's the superintendent, will be at our meeting next month. I have gotten some questions in general about why have multiple frameworks. All right, OSSI has its framework for evaluating schools across the city, and then we have our framework here. And I think it's important for us to kind of always have clearly in mind, like, why does PCSB have a framework for the charter sector? So we'd love to hear you say a bit about that.
So you, as board members, hold a lot of power in this sector because you are making decisions about schools opening, schools continuing, and everything in between. And so it's important that we as staff present you with an accountability system that will enable you to do your best oversight work. This tool, its primary audience is our board, and it's just really important to us that we design something that will support you in making oversight decisions and will support PCSB staff in making monitoring decisions on a day-to-day basis. We are thankful to have a statewide accountability system, and we see that as a tool, and OSSI sees that as a tool that will be helpful to parents and students who are making school enrollment decisions. But it doesn't carry the same weight as an accountability system that potentially informs a conversation about a school's continuance.
I would echo what Melody shared, and I will say that what is possible also with our framework, in addition to it being primarily an opportunity for board to make oversight decisions, is the ability to showcase where charter schools are uniquely providing a service that does not exist in other schools. So for example, our adult education space is a space that's not accurately or currently captured in our statewide system. We also have schools that only serve early childhood programming, but are public charter schools. And so having a framework that allows us to look at the unique performance of charter schools, including now the inclusion of school-specific measures, is a distinct factor with the state accountability framework. I would say that they are complementary, and as Melody said, serve different purposes. So I'm excited about our ability to enhance the framework to more accurately give you the information that you use. And I think that we have demonstrated our effort to work in collaboration with OSSI around a larger conversation about statewide accountability. I participated just this afternoon in the council hearing on our school improvement bill that would give OSSI some specific additional authority around school improvement. And I think having these tools both immediately in our toolbox, but across the state are helpful, and they provide distinct information for our respective constituencies.
I appreciate that. I do think, per Vice Chair Salmon's earlier remarks, the sort of communication challenge is a real one, right? How does this show up for parents, for school leaders, for folks who are collecting and responding to data requests from different agencies? It is true, a charter school in this city is a school in the city, and it's a school in the sector, right? It's a school in the state and a school in the sector. And so I think there's just multiple identities that are held there. I think that's true for a DCPS school as well. And then the other thing on communications, I was just thinking about this on the sort of the allowance for the kind of, up to 10%, right, of the framework to be for school specific measures. That is a big shift, and I think a positive one. And I think as part of the communication, a really, really important thing, at least from a school leader sector perspective, right? I think obviously there's the right messaging for parents and families, but to say this is really a more flexible framework than any we've ever had before, but one that still manages to be rigorous because of the safeguards we've put in place. I do think that matters a great deal.
I thank you for that. I want to build on it. The audience here, the kind of where you're coming in, the role you play or the position you're in will really influence how one feels about being evaluated. It is difficult. It's tense. It reveals all kinds of vulnerabilities because our shared commitment is in service to students, many of whom are children who are too far from opportunity. And this opportunity to choose your own school is part of big decisions that can make a big difference in people's lives. I want to emphasize that the information, the responsibility we have as the authorizer is to make informed decisions on schools that we have authorized in law, made possible, made accessible to parents and communities. And this whole exercise is in recognize the evolution the educational sector has gone through over the many years, is responsive to dynamics and changes that we have seen in the city over time. And what we have learned, what experts have taught us and shared in data science and modeling, and in unique programs that have been introduced that didn't exist 10, 15 years ago. So it is critical that LEA boards understand and are brought along in this journey. So this communications exercise, this is a community that I feel very strongly needs to understand their role in this. And this is an opportunity to learn how to ask more and better questions of how our collective work and service to students can be improved.
So one of the things that is, Board Member Rodriguez just talked about the mission specific goals, and having done this work, right? Like we had the special guest in July and then having attended NACS, et cetera, recognizing that is indeed something that is recognizing the uniqueness of our sector. Putting on my school leader hat, which is a former school leader hat, one of the other things that is unique, I think, about this new revised accountability framework is the emphasis on growth versus just proficiency. And I think it not only is it responsive to COVID, it is something that our city has faced for a long time. And when schools were judged, I think under the old framework, as a former school leader working in the part of the city where it was the toughest to move towards proficiency, I think growth, but not just growth for the sake of growth, but growth towards proficiency, which is what I think this framework is emphasizing, is really important. It really is, just understanding who we're serving, what this looks like. But I do think it's important for us to clarify this distinction because it also shows up very differently in each of the frameworks in terms of its weight. So can we spend some time talking about that, because I think it's important, one, to acknowledge it from school leaders' perspective and what this means to do the really hard, difficult work, but then to also explain why it shows up differently across the different frameworks. I'd like to understand that better.
So part of it has to do with the availability of data. So as I had shared a little bit earlier tonight, we need 2 years worth of Park/DC Cape data to even calculate growth to proficiency. So that's why it doesn't show up until you've got upper level elementary school students. Dr. Walker Davis or Kirsten.
By upper elementary, Melody, can we let's talk, go back to Philadelphia. Remember the movie Philadelphia? He's like, talk to me like I'm a 5th grader, right? But this is very important. We talk about communication and not talking from a place of like privilege and understanding and having lived in it for so long, but I am a parent. I am listening. What do you mean by that?
Sure. So the state OSSI doesn't expect schools to administer PARCC/DC CAPE until 3rd grade. So when we look at the primary sub-framework, for example, that's the first instance in which we've got PARCC/DC CAPE data. And at this point, we're just looking at it from an achievement standpoint, reporting on whether or not 3rd graders were proficient in ELA or math on the PARCC/DC CAPE assessment. When we get to the elementary sub-framework that goes all the way up to 5th graders, then we now have multiple years worth of PARCC data that we can speak to. So this gives us an opportunity to do measurement across 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 PARCC measures. 4 of those 6 measures require multiple years worth of data. And so the pre-K through 5 elementary sub-framework is the first instance in which we were able to introduce those growth measures based off of the state assessment.
So if my school ends at 4th grade, I go to DC Prep. I don't know which campus it is, but and it ends at 4th grade. Does that mean growth is not considered for my LEA?
It's still considered because you've got a 3rd grade and a 4th grade to account for. So you've got multiple years of PARCC testing that happens at that school.
Okay, so so it's not that I need to have 3rd and 4th and then you compare it against 5th. It is just 1 year to 1 year. Okay.
Exactly.
And then how does it show up on the pre-K through 8th? Does it look very similar to this?
Very similar, the difference being that we are breaking it down by grade band. So the story here with this revised accountability system is that we are pushing for nuance, and that means that we are isolating performance, making it as specific as possible. So in this case, there are lots of PARCC measures, and they are by grade band.
And is growth considered at all at high school? Can you put that one up for me?
Sure. So yes, growth does come into play in the high school framework. And we're actually still talking about the potential of doing growth to proficiency. That is something that OSSI is looking at doing in its accountability system. But it's just sort of being teased out and is not an official part of their system. And so we'll see what happens, how that plays out. But yes, there are growth measures in the high school framework based off of PARCC performance. There's also the access growth measure that again measures growth among emerging multilingual learners.
And 9th grade on track, what is that measuring?
9th grade on track is our way of deeming whether students are on track to graduate in 4 years. It is a measure that is specific to a high school with a 9th grade program. And we actually go into schools and take a look at high school transcripts and report cards and count whether or not they've got whether they've got at least 4 core classes plus 2 electives accounted for in their first 9th grade year.
Melody, staying on this slide, can you speak to one of our guiding principles is that an excellent school must be equitable. Can you speak to the equity principles that underlie the high school proposed framework?
Yeah.
Oh no, and then I'll just do an add-on quickly that to someone that might assert, wait a second, I see so much more emphasis on achievement here than on growth relative to some of the other sub-frameworks.
Right. So I think the big call out is not necessarily on the measures themselves, but just our approach to incorporating student group performance in the outcomes. That's by design driven by our equity emphasis. But then added to that is the access growth measure that is new to our system. It's not a new measure, but it is certainly new to our accountability system. And that I believe reflects our interest in seeing that emerging multilingual students are being well served across our portfolio. I think you can also see equity come through in the college and career acceptance measure. So as we had shared earlier, that used to just be a college acceptance measure and sort of assumed that the pathway after high school is college, but there are multiple pathways that are worthwhile after college, and broadening out this measure gives us an opportunity to celebrate how schools are supporting students in those alternative pathways. I think there's also a case to be made for the AP, IB, dual enrollment, and career and technical education measure. This was a part of the framework under the PMF, but we've given it some more weight. And this, again, looks at ways of setting up students for success beyond high school.
Great, thank you. That's helpful.
First, I want to make sure that board members don't have any other questions of us, because I actually have a question for board members. I do want to give board members an opportunity to elevate what you see as the potential in revising the framework. So as I mentioned, and as you know, we have been talking quite a bit to LEA leaders. We've had some opportunity to talk to school board members, and we've talked to a number of other stakeholders. And so we've been on our quote unquote roadshow talking about the reason that we are proposing revisions to our accountability system to you. But I would like an opportunity for particularly our stakeholders to hear board members' perspectives about why you specifically believe it's important to revise the accountability system. So you heard what we're planning to propose to you, and you will get that formally. But I wanted to ask each of you to lift up why you think it's important for us to be revising it, and what do you hope to see as a result of the changes that we are proposing tonight to the accountability system.
So I'm happy to begin. Oh, go ahead, Board Member Rodriguez. You can go ahead.
Oh, no. You spoke first. I just unmuted. So I think,
no, please, by all means, let me let you go. Oh, we're fighting to. Oh, go ahead. No, please.
Oh man. All right. Well, look at that. All right. I can go first. I'll say a few things. So first of all, I think it's worth just thinking for a minute about why we even have an accountability system. Like, what's it supposed to do? And I think if you were to boil it down to its simplest terms, you would say it attempts to evaluate how well a school is doing on all these different dimensions, on all these things we've said we care about, on equity, on fairness, on achievement, on growth, a number of other things that are listed in the principles that were presented earlier today. And I think it then tries to send a message to the school that says, here are some specific ways based on data that you can improve. And it attempts to send a message to parents and families that says, here's where this school is, here's the kind of school they are, to help inform them when they're making a choice. And that combination of, I hope, school leaders seeing what the system offers. The school leaders seeing what, how they're doing in the data, and then parents and families seeing where they want to go to school. Those things all exert upward pressure on those very same metrics, that they cause us to, that as students and families are going to the places that are performing the best, that encourages innovation to try to improve the schools that are behind, but it also encourages us to double down on and keep investing in those schools that have figured something out that's right. So that's why we have a system. And then I think about something you, Melody, said about how, as a board, we're entrusted with a pretty grave responsibility of determining kind of consequences for schools based on those performance levels, if they're higher or if they're lower. And that we want to make sure that we're thoughtful about that we're adapting those measures to current circumstances, to things we've learned over the course of the last 10 plus years of doing work under this framework. Things change. We learn things from what's going on in schools. But we want to make sure that that the standards are fair, that they're equitable, and that as the nature of the sector changes, as assessment systems change, that the framework is still relevant. That it's relevant for that informational purpose for families, and then for that improvement purpose for schools. So I think it's absolutely appropriate that we be doing this. It's incredibly difficult. It's incredibly high stakes. And then what would we hope to see ultimately? Well, we'd hope to see movement, right? We would hope to see a a dramatic improvement of school quality across the board in the sector, but also as a knock-on effect in schools in DC as a whole, right? As there's a kind of, as there's kind of an upward, a virtuous upward, sort of movement and virtuous circle of us continuing to keep improving, seeing the improvements of others, borrowing from those and other things like that. And I hope that it sees too that we have these principles that are respected, principles that, like the ones that you presented earlier, that we're rewarding high performance, that we're rewarding those who achieve great things with students, particularly those students who need the most help. But that we're also rewarding those for whom that are rising fast, that are growing fast, that we leave no student group behind. So that's, I think, reflected in the weights that you've shown today. There's a phrase we've been using in prior hearings, which is we want to make sure that our system doesn't penalize or advantage schools for which students they serve. And I think that's a key bedrock principle, and one that the old framework actually did imperfectly. So that's one, for example, concrete change that I'm hoping to see from this. And then finally, from all that improvement, that this framework is a tool, the kind of centerpiece of discussion that every stakeholder in the system uses to hold our schools and also us accountable for the work that we're doing to improve outcomes for kids.
Thank you.
Thank you. See, Board Member Rodriguez, that's why you went first.
I don't know about that. But there you go. Now it's definitely your turn.
Thank you kindly. So actually, my response to this question, Dr. Walker Davis, for this, I'm going to lean into sort of the belief quadrant. And again, tapping into my own identity as a parent, a native Washingtonian, former school leaders, and all the things that I've named. I think we're in a moment where our world is different. Coming out of the pandemic, just looking around the world today and all the things that we're having to deal with, and who the young people are after beginning to emerge on the other side of this. I think our world is different. And then coupled with that, we are ripe with opportunity to grow. And we're ripe with the opportunity to grow with information and things that we've learned getting through the pandemic, but just as things evolve. And so I am completely committed and excited to see that we are really taking into account the things that we've learned over the years. We're taking into account the moment that we are in as a city, as a sector, and we really are using these things as a tool to really help develop a framework that not only accurately represents where schools are, but more importantly, sets our students up as schools abide by this framework, do all the things necessary to move towards proficiency and move their students towards proficiency. We really and truly are setting our children up, and not just our children, all students, on a path to truly be able to choose the life that they want. All of this working out means that we have students who are better prepared, equipped with taking on all the challenges that the world will have before them as the world is continuing to grow. And DC's children will have the ability to engage in the world the way that they want, not based on lack. And so for me, this framework is important in order to keep our children, not children, but just our students as well, recognizing our adult ed, I haven't forgotten yet, but to make sure our students are well situated in this world that we're in to really contribute and bring all the greatness that they have on the inside. That's just where I see this.
When I think about why it's important for us to revise accountability framework, I'm always going to put back on that former charter school founder hat. I mean, the heart of the charter movement is autonomy in exchange for strong accountability. And I think the sector was created, and as founders of charter schools, we get a lot of autonomy to design our school model, to design what it looks like, what it feels like, to really be thoughtful about the inputs, et cetera. But we also have to be responsible for the outcomes of that work. And just as we expect schools to do their job well, we as a board have to have a strong accountability system that allows us to do our job well. And our job is to ensure that students are achieving, that they're thriving, and that they are getting better and prepared to take on this world. And we can only do that with a strong accountability framework that effectively measures both inputs and outcomes of this work. And I think the work that we've done on this new revised accountability framework, very different than its successor, takes into consideration the nuances of our student demographics, the variety of our schools, and what our city looks like as the city is also changing. And I think those are important aspects that will allow us to then do our job, which is to be the holders of the accountability in that equation, and hold our schools accountable for hopefully the great work that they will do in exchange for the accountability they've been given.
Thank you.
I'm going to move from the thinking quadrant to the believing quadrant. I believe more information is better than less. Or to be more precise, I think more information relevant to our decision-making is better than less. And I think that the revised accountability framework gives us more, better, more nuanced information than we currently get with the PMF. And the single best example of that to me is the new ability to look at student groups. I think that in doing our work, we have to be sure that the students most in need of high quality services are getting them. And school information presented simply at the school level without allowing us to dive into that can mask important information and allowing us to determine whether a school really is serving all of its students. I think that philosophy is woven throughout the revised accountability framework, but that's the example I'd pick to giving us a new kind of information that I think is critical to the decisions that we make.
Thank you.
You all know that I like to quote Joe Baker, the first board chair of this body. I pull out her book and I'm reminded that in the pioneering years of charter school authorizing, many authorizers focused mainly on approving or denying charter applications and less on establishing processes to ensure that the approved schools were actually meeting the terms of their charter agreements and achieving the intended results with students. Get to 2008, and this body, our predecessors, had fully transitioned into its role as a sole authorizer of all DC charter schools. And it was then that this body developed an oversight system in which all schools would be measured by a standard framework, one that would allow for the different levels and unique features among schools. We needed to think more critically about which data mattered most and choose the best technology to process the array of data. We also had to think about which program inputs and performance outcomes were most indicative of student preparation for higher education and career success. You can go on and on here. The work that we are doing here, this agency has an obligation to exercise its authority to learn over time and evolve in a responsive way to what we have learned, to what the data are telling us, and to what we learn about what is, as Jim just put, the right data to inform our decision making. It's to ensure that we're meeting our mission, that every student receives a quality education. So in order to do that well, we need a more complete understanding of how the schools we have authorized are doing that. We must evolve with this. So the time has come for us to evolve from the last performance management framework. So as I mentioned earlier, I hope this is a clarifying exercise for schools to more completely understand where they are so they can focus on where they need to go in service to their school communities. And yes, the last few years have been hard. We have the enabling conditions in DC to achieve what few, if any, other jurisdictions can achieve elsewhere in the country. We can improve student learning outcomes so that students, especially those from historically marginalized groups, are on a path to a fulfilling life. So in the short term, I hope to see that there's an alignment of energy and effort towards student success as measured by this system. This nuance, meaningfully nuanced, not nuance for the sake of hiding information or not wanting to share tough news, but meaningfully. And it's going to take time and it requires every part of our system to work together. This body has its responsibility. LEA boards, as I mentioned, have the responsibility to understand their role in governing schools, and executive directors and school leaders who are day-to-day devoted to their students and school communities to embrace this and motivate their learning teams to swim in the same direction. And through the ongoing work of our enduring partnership priorities, we must work with our partners to ensure LEAs have what they need so they can focus on instructional rigor and student success with confidence that other city partners are there to support on extra school needs. This is all of us here. This meeting tonight, we're focused on this body, but this speaks to much more that we as a city, the obligation we have to our kids in our school communities, students of all ages and their communities.
Thank each of you for sharing that. I know I've had an opportunity to meet with board members and talk about your vision. And I just want to take this time to acknowledge the wisdom of this board in naming that this was an important effort and that it was time, as Chair Cruzy said, for us to revisit the tools at our disposal. I've said this many times that this process actually started even before I became executive director. And so I want to actually acknowledge the team that has been working very hard on this work, certainly led by our data and accountability team, but this has been a cross-departmental effort to get us to this point. And I really appreciate the partnership of this board in naming that this was important, being involved in sharing and crafting guiding principles that could help us as a staff. And I know it's not done. We're not asking for you to vote on anything tonight. We will be back to ask you to vote, and we have a lot more work to fine tune and bring you a document to vote on. But I thought it was important for you to elevate what you hope to see possible. I think we're in alignment with where we are right now and have done our best to meet those goals. But it's important for our public to understand that this is a shared agency commitment. And I do think about the legacy that we are going to leave for all of the students that we serve by the important work that we are collectively doing right now.
The one thing I'd want to add, Dr. Walker Davis, is while we definitely have the responsibility to vote and all of that, part of what I'd also like to see when you all do come before us is what is our plan around communication? And when I say, I mean, really like our true stakeholders, those parents who don't have the time and or capacity to sit or maybe even ability to sit and watch this meeting, or right, those parents who, again, when I was being, referring to the movie, but how do we break this down in a way that it is digestible to those who are going to be most impacted by it? I think it is one of the things that I'd want to see from you all when you do come to us, in addition to asking us to think about the technical and all of those pieces. I also want us to think about the practical and what does it mean to make this make sense. We have been sitting in it for years now, right, at this point, and digesting it and talking about it over and over again. But we got really nuanced, not only because we wanted to make sure we knew what was going on, but those who are being impacted by the work need to understand what's going on. And so I want to make sure, whether that is, hearing from the comms team, whatever that looks like, something that also just is demonstrating our commitment to making sure that our stakeholders understand. I know you don't want another meeting. I don't know if that means that we need to be doing community-based meetings to understand what this looks like, particularly, and to Melody's point, thinking about the fact that once this is out, right, we may not revisit this again big time in 5 years from now. That is a child's graduate, potentially a freshman now in college, right? And so what does that actually look like to make sure that our stakeholders truly understand? I'd be willing as board member, and I'm sure, given this group that I have the honor to work with, if we did like a town hall, right, and we talked and we heard from the families and those who are impacted by it as well. It doesn't just need to be staff, right? We are also responsible. So hold us accountable too, to just be as thoughtful and creative as we can about making sure that this is not something that is just done to families, that it is something that they are also understanding and can also help to inform, even if that is to say, break it down so it makes sense to me. I think that is very, very important.
Thank you. Yes, appreciate that. Melody, can you just put the timeline slide up one more time? And what we did not talk about tonight is the other part of this work, which is the implications of our framework. So I just wanted to put this up here again. I won't reiterate the things that I said before, but concurrent with this process, we're also developing the charter goals policy that will help articulate how a school develops their goals, potentially adopts the framework as its goals, and what are the criteria and standards for doing that. So Melody, if there's anything you wanted to say about that process, and then if there are any remaining questions about what we presented tonight, we'll be able to take those. Melody.
Sure. So the board approved the first iteration of the charter goals policy back in July, and PCSB staff, led by Starling Timp, are making revisions to the policy right now, and we hope to start circulating a draft updated version of that policy to school leaders and to this board over the next few weeks. And our aim is to have the open for public comment, public hearing, and vote for that revised policy happen alongside the adoption of the revised accountability system.
Thank you. Chair Cruzy, we are done with our presentation. And as I said, if there are any other questions, we're happy to answer those.
We've got a busy couple months ahead of us.
More than a couple.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for this tonight. Melody, in particular, I think you probably had the most airtime tonight and gotten a lot of questions from us. So thank you for this. I believe now, is there any new business, board members? If none, I will take a motion to adjourn and look forward to all the follow-up from this in our next gathering.
I move to adjourn the November 20th, 2023 board meeting.
Second.
Secretary Edna Fenning?
Thank you. Chair Cruzy?
Aye.
Board Member Wright?
Aye.
Board Member Rodriguez?
Aye.
Vice Chairman Sandman?
Aye.
And I, Shakura Adamafanian, I'm an aye.
Good night, everybody.
Thank
Good
you,
night.
everyone.